Hey there, it's Nick Terzo, and this is the Radical Podcast. No, we won't be overthrowing any governments, but we will be learning from radical creatives who rule the world. Welcome back to The Radical. I'm Nick Terzo. It's been a few months since we last dived into film music on this show, and this week's guest is a master at connecting music, visual, and narrative. If you watch a film by most any A-list director, then my guest, film music supervisor Randall Poster's name is all over those film credits. Directors such as Martin Scorsese, Wes Anderson, Richard Linklater, Todd Phillips, and Todd Haynes, to name a few, all rely on Randall's impeccable music curation. You will also recognize his work from TV and streaming series such as The Queen's Gambit, Tiger King, Boardwalk Empire, and Vinyl. Randall also recently produced the film The Devil All the Time, which premiered recently on Netflix. In this episode, we will learn why iconic film directors depend on Randall to identify, curate, and guide the music which enhances storytelling in their films. Coming up, my conversation with the incredibly talented Randall Poster. Hey, Randall.
Hello there, Nick. How are you?
Welcome.
Thank you.
I am thrilled to have you. I think this would need to possibly be a 10-part podcast to cover the questions I have for you and the length of your career and your contributions. But we'll do the short version as part one.
Okay.
How is your life during this COVID? I mean, I assume productions are shut down. Are you working?
Yeah, I mean, my life is complicated, as everyone's life has been complicated by it. I had a bunch of projects that were in post-production at the beginning of March. So those were, for the most part, we were able to proceed at a certain, progressively. There were a couple movies that stopped shooting that were in production. There were a couple things that didn't get into production because of the complications. And over the course of time, a movie that was preparing is actually going to started shooting today in Los Angeles under the new sort of protocols. It's people are feeling their way forward, but as cases rise, I think it becomes harder and harder to count on any calendar, really.
And I mean, are the protocols just simply, at least in California, that it just limits who's in the room? I mean, is that what happens?
Yeah, and I think with testing and I think crews largely, are just trying to figure out how to go about their business, where, in a way where they had, say, easier access to the actors and to set, where, say, props would jump in and they would turn the soda can around, or, I think those things are not happening in the same way. We're touching up makeup or whatever else it might be.
So it'll be much more of a post thing if that needs to be done.
Yeah, or I don't know, or else they're just, or actors are going to have to be much more aware of what they look like at every moment, and take some responsibility for those kinds of adjustments.
Well, there's some that are vain enough that shouldn't be too much of a problem, but
yeah. Well,
so explain to me, because I've had Steve Gazicki on earlier when we did this podcast, and people complain to me that you didn't really get into what his job is. And can you get more into the elements of what it is?
So my standard response to that is that a music supervisor helps a director or the creative team for both imagine and then execute a musical strategy for the movie, right? So whether that's figuring out how to navigate any on-camera music that's going to be happening in the course of production, or ultimately figuring out what the what the musical element is doing to help reinforce time and place, or to render insight into character, how aggressively you're going to use songs to a cinematic end, in terms of where you're using songs sometimes not simply as it's playing out of a radio, but more as sort of a score, or um, an overhanging dramatic element. And then oftentimes, not all the time, but working closely with the director and the composer to figure out what the original music is going to do, and where it goes, and things like that.
I mean, I've known you a while. I'm incredibly kind of intimidated by you and impressed by your breadth of understanding music in so many different areas, historical periods, the scope of.
Yeah, I mean, some of that comes from. I mean, some of that comes from just studying it, right? Where in terms of, like, I always talk about how, say, in working on Boardwalk Empire, the first season of Boardwalk Empire was set in 1920, and even Mr. Scorsese is not really grounded in music that preceded, say, 1925, 1920. There's no radio, and just sort of becoming, doing, sort of leaning on any kind of academic background I would have, and researching, finding some people who are more expert in the era, and picking their brains, and sort of relying on the kindness of others.
Right. And I mean, Matt, for you, you won a Grammy, right, for that somewhere along the way?
For Boardwalk
Yeah.
Empire, yeah, we
That was
Grammy for.
just incredible to me, the work you did on that in that period. I mean, I was
Yeah,
floored
yeah,
by that.
thank you,
So,
thank you. Well, it's great, it's great repertoire. We brought just great singers to sort of render great repertoire, and I've been working for a long time with a guy named Vince Giordano, who sort of lives in this era of music, or in these eras of music, 20s and 30s primarily. And so he has a lot of the period arrangements, or adapts to, the arrangements to a period style. And so I thought, I think that what was we did was that, even though it was uh, antique repertoire on a certain level, I think we brought a lot of life to it.
yeah, you sure did. So, and what is the for you that you have this? I mean, it speaks to your reputation and your skills. You have this cadre of A-list directors you work with, from Martin Scorsese to Wes Anderson, Todd Phillips, Rick Linklater. What bonds form between you and a director that keeps that ongoing?
Well, I would say, for instance, like with Todd Phillips and with Wes, I met them very at the start of their careers, really. So, I would say that the good fortune that I had was that I, began working with my contemporaries, and they just kept making movies. Todd Haynes among them. I mean, Todd Haynes and I were college classmates. Um, so, I think that was my good fortune. Um, and I think, at least with those three directors, you know, though they stylistically very different, they share, I think, a lot of the same assets. They bring a lot of the same assets to their process, in terms of just being obsessive, super smart, are unafraid to use music creatively, um, are willing to um, forego any type of established rules for how you use music. Um, and so, I mean, that's been, one of the great, just sort of one of the great gifts in my life, is to be able to continue to continue to make movies with these guys.
Right? And is there, in the director realm, is it more challenging for you in your position if the director has some musical vision versus not having any, or is one better than the other?
Well, I mean, if they have a genuine musical vision, I mean, there are times where people think they do have a musical
Right.
vision. And again, it's oftentimes, the preconception of how music is going to work in your film is belied by the practical application, right? So you think the music is going to do one thing, and then somehow it doesn't really
Yeah.
render. It doesn't really deliver, or it doesn't have the impact that you imagine that it would. So, but no, I mean, I think to your point is that it is always a benefit to me when a director has a vivid point of view, and hopefully the confidence to have a dialogue, or also, has the confidence to allow a certain kind of process to get underway, where, okay, actually, here's something we hadn't thought of, or this might be something that we should consider, or
Right. As you mentioned that earlier, I mean, and you mentioned sometimes things don't render, right? And the music doesn't
right.
set up. Like how far into that are you normally, I mean, can it be
Well, I try to get involved as soon as possible. I mean, oftentimes I get involved early because there's a element of music that plays in the course of production, right? And so that has to be dealt with. And But I like to be involved as much as I can be. A lot of times, say with Wes, for instance, is that a lot of oftentimes there's a good amount of work that gets done between the movies, where we kind of he has some kind of notion that we then explore and expand, and then are prepared to apply it, once we are underway.
about it? And like in a normal film, like how much music will you kind of, let's say, experiment with or temp into a scene or like, I mean, is it a ton of music or by now are you kind of more focused and it doesn't turn into that so much?
No, I would say there's, generally you sort of go through at least a half a ton, and I don't mind going through a ton, it's just because sometimes you just don't know where the exploration is going to lead you. It's not so much fun when it becomes just sort of a practice of redundancy, right? Where a director says, "Oh, I love that song. Can I hear 100 songs just like that?" It's like, well, what are you looking for? You know, um, so it all depends. I mean, sometimes, what do they say? Somebody once told me, a director, when I started out working out with them, is that they said, "I'm not a pilgrim." Is that they aren't going to be early settlers.
And how do you balance, let's say, existing songs versus something that you actually, um, kind of refer or have someone build for you versus composition in the film? Like, how do those things coexist, or how does one become more important than the other? Does one?
Like, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me.
Here's what I'm saying. I'm saying basically there's songs that already exist. There's songs that you can commission for a film and say we want an original piece of music,
Right.
and there's
Right.
the composer who's composing
The
score.
score.
Yes, how do those
Yeah.
things intertwine through a film?
Well, I mean, I think you do. I mean, I think as far as, I mean, instinctively, I guess I always want to put period music in period pieces, right? For instance, with one of the challenges of, say, um, Boardwalk Empire, was that the original recordings weren't technically up to, were not technically viable to use, right? You couldn't get clean recordings, right? And then there are situations where, say if you're trying, if they're, for instance, I did the show Vinyl, where we had a lot of um, uh, historical musical characters performing on camera, and so we sort of made the decision that it would be more exciting and more fun to re-record those things, and also with re-recording too, it gives you the flexibility where like you can isolate a bass guitar, or you can take the vocals in and out wherever you want to, or things like that. So I don't know exactly, like there's a certain point where it feels like a movie should have either new songs or newly recorded versions of songs. And then as far as like the balance of songs versus score, I mean, you feel that out a little bit, and then there's a point in the process where you do something called spotting, where you like go through the movie and you sort of say, okay, we should have a song obviously goes here, but let's have this, a thematic score here. And then you have to sort of have a bit of a dialogue with the composer where you say, like, in a situation where you say that could be a song, and the composer says, or I'll say it, is that, what, I think this needs to be score, because I think you need this moment to establish the uh we should to establish the thematic through line.
Right. And do you have, I mean, I know directors kind of build their teams as they go and keep them somewhat intact. I mean, on the composer front, I mean, do you have say in that? I mean, if a project doesn't look like it's aligned with that particular composer, or is that a director call or?
I mean, that depends. I mean, there's situations where a director is more, or the producers are more interested in hearing my point of view than other, in other situations. I mean, I always point to as far as another question that I get asked is that, well, how involved are you in directing the score of a movie? And some of that, it just depends. Like, for instance, I've worked with Sam Mendes quite a bit, and Sam has his relationship with Tom Newman um, uh, preceded mine, and so he doesn't really need me to mediate between him and Tom. And then there are other situations where music can be talking about music can be quite abstract. And so really sometimes I think it's really my job is to sort of help establish a common vocabulary, so we're all talking about the same thing, or as much as possible using the same words to describe the same thing, or using groups of words to describe the same things.
And has there ever been, like in your time doing this, and I know every situation's unique, but has there ever been like an artist that you really, really love, or a song that you've tried to get into any kind of scene on one of the movies you're working in, and just it's never happened? It just, you can't find the place.
Yeah, 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 it happens. And I mean, that's why it's kind of sweet when if you finally succeed in
Yeah.
getting it in there. I mean, for instance, there's a song by this group, the Vogues, called "You're the One," which I finally succeeded in getting into this series called The Queen's Gambit. That just opened, I think, last week on Netflix, a limited series. Um, I worked on a film with a director named Antonio Campos called Christine a few years ago. And the first 45 I ever bought was Laughing by the Guess Who. And so I got a great kick out of the fact that I got Laughing finally into a movie. But then I also tell stories how there's this track. There is this R&B singer named Katie Webster, and I'm gonna age myself right now, but you probably have shared this experience. Is that, like, I think when I was in like 11th grade, I was driving home from a friend's house, and this song came on the radio, and it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I pulled over, and I was just saying, please back announce this song, please back announce this song, and like had to endure like one song, then another song. I was like, please. And finally it was like, okay, Katie Webster, Never Let Me Go. And I tried to get that song into 30 movies, right? I would always try it. And then finally, like one night I was watching True Blood, right? And they had it on as an end credit of True Blood. And Gary Callamore was supervised it. And I called him the next day, and I was like, Katie Webster, Never Let Me Go. Fuck you. I've been wanting to use that for so long. It was both like bravo, fuck you, but um, so that happens, that happens. And then there are things where you think like you have it, where you finally have placed it, and then somehow it ends up out of the movie. So it can be a little bit of a heartbreak, but I
Yeah, I
keep at
love
it.
that. I love those stories because I do hear those, and that's funny. You waited all that time, and Gary Calamar snaked it from you.
Yeah. Yeah, he got it. He beat me to it. Doesn't happen too often, but
So on the things where you work more like on the series, right, versus a film. I mean,
right.
that has to be a much larger ingestion of material. And how do you budget your times? Like
Well,
when
well, I've not really been very interested in broadcast television because that's so fast, and they really don't, unless it's something that's scripted, they don't really care about creating a really dynamic musical element, or they don't spend enough time kind of trying to make that happen. But for the most part, the series that I've been on have been more on I think that, say Boardwalk Empire or Vinyl both really had um, cinematic production values, and had, a cinematic ambition. And so even though it was like working on 10 movies in a year to a certain degree, it was, you could pace yourself and you could go along with it. With some of these other, as things have oriented more towards television, or that, we're in a moment with like, what is television and what is, ultimately it's all television. Um, it can be a challenge to sort of keep up with all the edits and all of the episodes, um, but you just sort of do your best.
and is there like when you do sometimes the sequels, like The Hangover or whatever? Is there a template to that you just stick through all three, or is it changed dynamically each time? I've seen all of them, but just curious from your point of view.
Uh, I think, I don't think that there's ever any assumptions really. There were no, I think that, Todd uses music at points to great comic effect, which is situational. And Todd is really good with music. He's really bold with music. We generally have really healthy budgets doing those movies. So, we don't, we really can sort of um, chase some really big titles. And by that, I mean, hip hop. What is that politically
I
correct
can't
still?
keep
Hip
up.
hop. Yeah. So, because again, those things are always complicated by the fact that there's
Yes.
samples and so many writers, and, the splits are all wacky, and so those things can be challenging. Um, so I don't think that there's any real, I don't think there's any real, I don't think it ever veers into sort of the formula.
And on the licensing tip, do you do that all in house, or you have that done out of house? Someone you work with?
It depends. Sometimes a studio will do it. Sometimes we'll bring in a licensing service. Sometimes, I get somebody who works closely with me to sort of take control of it. It just depends.
And you just produced a Netflix film.
I just produced a movie with Antonio Campos called The Devil All the Time, currently playing on Netflix.
It's great. It's dark.
Yeah, it's pretty dark. It's pretty funny. Is that, I actually produced a movie. That's how I started in the movie business. I produced a movie when I got out of college. I wrote a script with a friend of mine about the college radio station, and we developed it and workshopped it at the Sundance Lab and made this movie in 1990. Um, and that was sort of my introduction. And also because I just always like love music and love movies, and oversaw the music, and really came out of that experience wanting to work with great film directors, and thought that by focusing on music, that would be the best point of contact. And that's sort of the way that it worked out. And so here it is, whatever it is, 25 plus years later, and I made another movie. And it's funny is because, it's very, very dark, and I get a lot of like that's the movie I didn't really see that coming. But I just really, what happened was is I read the book, and I'd read a collection of stories by Donald Ray Pollock called Knock 'em Stiff, and then read the novel and just like, I think this would be an interesting movie. And I was working on Christine with Antonio at the time, and he shared my instinct for it, and we developed it over the course of a couple of years, and then was able to attach some, Tom Holland and Rob Pattinson to it, and then we got it going on.
It's a good one
Um,
during this stay-at-home order that we're all under, so to speak. This is a really good movie.
I think so. A lot of people have seen the movie, and I'm
I
very
love
proud
your
of it. I
music
love it.
choices too. It's very good, very good. So,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you.
people better watch this movie or there'll be trouble. Um, is there any particular like director or is there a musician that you've died to work with that you haven't? I mean, look, you have this stellar group of guys, but
Yeah, I don't, I don't, you know what? I don't really think that there's anybody that's missing really. I mean, I really am interested in working with younger filmmakers. Um, looks like I'm going to work on a film that Johnny Greenwood is going to do the score for, which is somebody I wanted to work with. I did some work with him. He was part of the group that we put together when we made all of those glam rock era songs for Todd Haynes's Velvet Goldmine. He was part of that group. And so that's happening, I believe, knock on wood. I don't know. I mean, I think I could help Steven Spielberg out a little bit.
well, you have most of the grades. He might be one of the only ones missing on your list.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I just say because I just think that I think the music could be better and the songs could be better in
Yeah, yeah,
Spielberg
yeah.
movies.
And so when you work like with Linklater on Boyhood, like, and that's such a
Right.
extended piece of work. How did that work for you
Yeah.
really during that?
Well, I've worked with Rick a bunch over the years, and we actually coincidentally we talked on Friday about something that he's working on right now. With Boyhood, Rick had that pretty well plotted out as far as like the songs he wanted to use, and you know, um, really, I would say that largely my primary role in that film was to make sure that he got everything that he wanted. That was really, I would say. I mean, sometimes that is my role. Is really, um, just make sure the director gets what he wants. Whether that in terms of like that, in a sense, what you're saying about licensing, even though I may not be technically sending out the request letters, is that almost every song in every movie at some point I have to get involved to try to lasso it, and that was really in terms of just using all of my experience and all of my relationships to sort of make that massive songs,
Mm. Not to
possible.
get too down the rabbit hole on technical stuff like licensing and stuff. I mean, do you see it getting,
Mm.
is anyone waking up to making it any easier for people these days, or is it still a struggle?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how they, I don't know how. I mean, on a certain level, it's gotten easier in that I think that when I first started out, there were bands and artists who just like, I never will license to whatever it is. I'm not licensing my music. And I think, as the retail market went upside down, people were more open to it and saw it more as a vehicle to make people aware of their music. Um, but no, I mean, it's not. It's complicated in the sense that there is no blue book. Everything is a negotiation. Generally, you're not dealing with one entity. You're certainly dealing with two in terms of who owns the recording and who are the writers. Oftentimes, there are multiple writers. It still gets complicated when you have guys in bands who hate each other and one doesn't want the other one to make it. I mean, there's the human element enters into almost all of it, or people don't, or there's a situation where, as there's been consolidation in the music business where two companies merge and they fire half the staff, and then all of a sudden nobody knows who's the person that talks to this artist, who, they have no relationship with they don't even know who to call, or they don't even know that they own it, or, where they've where they're, especially in period pieces where, they've inherited labels, they've bought companies that have these assets that nobody was ever aware of. So, but again, that's, like I said, sometimes is that the challenges is what sometimes makes your use of a piece of music more unique, or that maybe in a certain situation, nobody but me is going to get you the rights to use a piece of music.
I can see that. And I mean, the economics of it, from a soundtrack point of view, I mean, have changed greatly. In the 90s, we were just banging those things out and selling millions and millions and millions. It was a wonderful time
Right.
for music soundtracks or film
Yeah.
soundtracks. Is it,
Yeah.
how,
Yeah. I missed that. I missed that. I
yeah, I was
missed
gonna
that
say you
almost
kind of came
completely.
in maybe towards just the end of it or yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I got a little bit of it, but not, I certainly, but again, also I wasn't, there was a moment in time where like record companies were financing film music budgets. Right. And so, and that was never really where I was in the center of that, because I never wanted to have to listen to the head of a record company to tell me what songs that I needed to put into a movie. And neither did the directors.
It was an interesting period. I mean, I had my run with a
Yeah. Look,
couple,
yeah.
of the larger ones like Last Action Hero, where we had, huge budgets and the soundtrack did very well. The film didn't really.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it was a
Yeah.
different time, different time. So you have to listen to a ton of music. Do you get any pleasure from listening anymore? Do you have time, or is it all work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can still, I mean, I think I still can respond to music as a civilian, really. Um, and, um, and a lot of times my listening habits, are, they're somewhat dictated by the projects that I'm working on. Right. So, if I'm working on Superfly, I'm doing a deep dive into, Atlanta, and if I'm doing, the devil all the time, I'm mining the Billboard country music charts of 1957. So that's sort of the focus of my, at points that, I'm very pointed in sort of what I'm listening to. But I try to keep an open ear, and again, I'm not. I mean, I would say really in terms of because I'm not a musician. I'm not really technical in terms of my understanding of music. Is that, whether it's true or not, I've always felt that one of my assets was the fact that at least I knew what I liked.
That's a good asset. It's proven to be a very good asset. So yeah, you've done
Yeah, it's
pretty
been
well.
pretty good
So I mean, staying current for you really is that necessary in what you do?
to a certain degree.
Hmm.
I work, I work hard at that, to stay current
Do
to a
your
certain
daughters
degree.
turn you
Yeah.
on anything?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
nice. That's always a nice resource.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, for the first time, they're really becoming more interested in sort of looking back and making some of the connections. But, you know, one of my daughters, it's hip hop all the time for the most part. Um, and, and my younger daughter is, I think, more interested in sort of
Hmm.
legacies.
Interesting. And what do you have upcoming? Like, what's on your plate that you can talk about? Or
Um, well, I've done, this show Queen's Gambit is out right
tell
now
me
as
about
of
that. I
last
haven't seen
week.
it.
It's basically, it's a based on a novel set in the mid-century, mid 20th century, about this young girl who's orphaned and becomes a chess prodigy, and kind of, marks her journey through kind of her adolescence, and the intricacies of the master chess world. I know that that's not the most exciting preview, but it's very well done.
How many episodes is a season? 7.
7.
Okay. And what music period were you working in for that one?
Uh, in the largely in the early 60s, 60s. And then I have uh, a bunch of, or a handful of documentaries that I've been working on. I have Todd Haynes has made a Velvet Underground documentary, um, that's really quite special. Questlove is finishing a documentary about these series of concerts in Harlem in 1969 that kind of got lost and was overshadowed by Woodstock, sort of, which was happening coincidentally.
Were those civil rights driven concerts?
Then,
I mean, is that the point of them, or not so much?
I think it was sort of, like, I guess to a certain degree, but it was more about celebrating Black culture. They had these concerts in Morris Park over the course of a few weekends. So yeah, I mean, there's a civil rights component to it for sure. And then Mr. Scorsese has made a series of short documentaries with Fran Lebowitz that we've been working on for quite some
interesting.
time. So those are some things that'll come out, I don't know,
interesting,
soonish.
Very interesting. So, all right, May. Well, I usually ask people what they're listening to. I don't think I'm going to bother you with that question. That's always my wrap question, because you're probably listening to everything. So,
yeah. Kim Petras, Hard to Break, over and over and over again.
Okay.
That's one that's a bit of a, it's like one of those things where I like the studio version, the unplugged version, but that's like a song that I just think is just a guilty pleasure of mine. And actually, I have a record that's coming out, or they came out 2 weeks ago. We made a record with Loudon Wainwright with the Vince Giordano Big Band. So 30 Tigers put that out. Sort of American songbook, but Loudon's always been one of my favorite singers, and he just destroys.
I didn't know that. I learned something new.
Yeah.
So he's a very nice man. So very talented. I'd be curious to hear that for sure. So
yeah.
All right, my friend. Well, I'm going to let you go.
All right, Nick. Great to see you. Okay.
Thank you. Stay healthy, and
okay. I look forward to seeing you in person sometime.
Hopefully, sooner the better. I can be in New York, the happier I'll be. So, all right. Thanks, buddy.
All right, bye-bye.
Have a good day. Well, that's our show this week. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe even learned a little something. To follow what's going on with this podcast, you can go to theradicalpod.com. Theradicalpod.com. You'll find show notes and past episodes, and even a little swag there if you want a t-shirt or a hat. Also, I would be honored if you'd subscribe at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Till next week.